she finally asked him on a Tuesday, and the question cracked the morning open like a rifle shot. "Sheriff Hayes." Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the fence post, the weathered wood groaning faintly under the pressure of her fingers. "You have been standing at this fence every single morning for 3 weeks. I have watched you from my kitchen window while the coffee goes cold and the biscuits burn. So I am asking you, plainly and without any patience left in me, what is it that you want?" Seth Hayes did not flinch. He had faced down outlaws in the street, had stared into the barrel of a Colt revolver at close enough range to see the copper primer on the cartridge, and he had not flinched then either. But something about Inez Lawson standing in the pale November light of 1882, her dark hair half-pinned, and her eyes blazing with a fury that was only barely covering something rower underneath, something that looked almost like fear, made his chest tighten in a way no gunfight ever had. He turned his hat in his hands, once, twice. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. "Every morning I just wanted to make sure." The silence between them stretched long enough for a hawk to drift across the whole width of the Montana sky above their heads. Inez Lawson stared at him, and for one terrible second her jaw trembled. Then her chin came up, hard and proud, and the gate swung open. "Then you had better come inside," she said, "and tell me why." And that was how it started, though the real beginning was nowhere near so simple. The real beginning was tangled up in secrets and buried loyalties, and the particular kind of grief that people in Harlan Creek, Montana, in the autumn of 1882 wore the way they wore their coats. Tight, necessary, never talked about. Harlan Creek sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges of ponderosa pine, close enough to the mountains that the wind came down sharp even in September, and the first snows arrived before anyone was ready for them. The town had grown up around a single general store and a creek crossing that the Northern Pacific Railroad had considered, and then abandoned in favor of a route 20 miles east. That abandonment had left Harlan Creek with a permanent chip on its collective shoulder, and a population that never quite broke 300 souls, all of whom knew each other's business, and most of whom would have cheerfully denied it. Seth Hayes had come to Harlan Creek in the spring of 1880 as a deputy, following a sheriff named Aldous Crane who died of pneumonia 8 months later, and left Seth holding a badge he had never quite intended to keep. He was 34 years old when the story begins, a broad-shouldered man with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of weathered pine, a man who spoke rarely and listened always, which made him either very trustworthy or very dangerous depending on who in town you asked. He had been born in Ohio, had come west at 19 with nothing but a bedroll and a stubborn idea that the frontier rewarded honest labor, and had spent 15 years learning the hard way that it rewarded something else entirely. He had been married once briefly, to a woman named Clara who had died in the winter of 1878 from complications following a difficult birth. The child had not survived either. Seth had grieved in the way men of that era grieved, which was to say he had gone quiet and stayed quiet, and put the grief somewhere deep inside himself, where it could not interfere with the practical business of living. He had come to Harlan Creek partly because it was far from the place where Clara was buried, and partly because distance had seemed like the only remedy left to him. Inez Lawson had come to Harlan Creek under entirely different circumstances. She had arrived in July of 1881. 18 months before the morning she finally opened her gate to Seth Hayes, stepping off a freight wagon with 2 trunks, a 7-year-old boy named Caleb, and the particular set expression of a woman who has already survived the worst thing that can happen to her and has decided, consciously and deliberately, that nothing else will break her. She was 30 years old, dark-haired, sharp-featured, with hands that showed she had worked hard for most of her life, and eyes that showed she had thought hard for all of it. Her husband, Thomas Lawson, had been dead for 8 months when she arrived. He had died in a mining collapse outside of Butte, leaving Inez with Caleb, $200 in savings, a piece of land on the edge of Harlan Creek that Thomas had purchased on faith the previous year, and absolutely no intention of going back to her family in Tennessee and hearing the words "she had told you so" from her mother's mouth. The land was 40 acres of decent grazing with a 3-room house that needed work and a garden plot that needed more. She had made it work. By the autumn of 1882, Inez Lawson's fence was straight, her garden was producing, she had taken in 2 boarders to supplement her income, and her son Caleb was thriving in the 1-room schoolhouse on the east side of town. She had built something real and fragile and entirely her own, and she was not interested in letting anyone close enough to threaten it, which made Seth Hayes's daily appearances at her fence something between a puzzle and an irritant. She had first noticed him in mid-October, when the aspens had gone gold and the mornings had that particular crystalline coldness that meant winter was no longer a rumor. She had been looking out her kitchen window at 6 in the morning, waiting for the coffee to come up on the iron stove, when she had seen the tall figure of the sheriff standing at her property line, hat in hand, looking toward the house. He had stayed for perhaps 10 minutes, then walked back toward town. She had assumed it was a coincidence, a man taking his morning walk, pausing to look at something. The mountains, perhaps, the way the frost lay on the grass. He was there the next morning too, and the morning after that. By the end of the first week, she had begun to wonder if she had inadvertently done something illegal. By the end of the second week, she had begun to feel the particular heat of anger that comes from being watched without explanation, from being the subject of someone else's attention without any say in the matter. By the third week, she had resolved to confront him, and it was that resolution that had brought her to the fence on a Tuesday morning in November, breath coming white in the cold air, asking him plainly what he wanted. Now she led him through the gate and up the path to her front door, and the weight of all those unspoken mornings sat between them like a third person as she pushed the door open and gestured him inside. The house was warm, wood smoke and coffee and something baking, and it was orderly in a way that spoke of conscious effort, of a woman who understood that order was a form of control, and that control was something she needed. Seth stepped inside and removed his hat entirely, holding it against his chest, and Inez turned to face him across the kitchen table. "Sit down," she said, because it was easier to manage a conversation if the other person was seated and she was not. He sat. She poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if he wanted any, because he was in her house now and her house ran by her rules, and she set one in front of him and stood on the other side of the table with her own. "Now," she said, "talk." Seth Hayes looked at the coffee cup, then up at her. He had the deliberate quality of a man who chose his words the way a surgeon chose instruments, one at a time and with specific purpose. "3 weeks ago," he said, "I received a letter from the county marshal's office in Helena. It concerned your husband." Inez did not move, but something shifted in her eyes, something careful and watchful closing down over whatever had been open there a moment before. "Thomas has been dead for nearly 2 years, she said. "I know that," Seth said. "The letter wasn't about his death, it was about his life, specifically about what he was doing in the 6 months before the Butte mining collapse." The silence in the kitchen was so complete that Inez could hear Caleb moving in the back room, the small shuffling sounds of a boy getting ready for school. "You had better," she said very quietly, "say what you mean and say it straight." Seth set both hands flat on the table, a gesture she would come to recognize as his way of signaling that he was about to say something he did not want to say. "The marshal's office has been investigating a series of land fraud cases across 3 counties, he said. "They believe Thomas Lawson was involved, not as a victim, as a participant." The words landed in the kitchen like stones dropped into still water, each one sending ripples outward that changed the shape of everything they touched. Inez put her coffee cup down. She looked at the wall above Seth's head for a moment, something calculating moving behind her eyes, and then she looked back at him. "What kind of participation?" she said. He was allegedly working with a man named Cord Heller, Seth said. Heller has been buying up land claims using forged documents and reselling them to settlers at inflated prices. The settlers believe they have good title. They do not. When the original owners surface, or when the territorial courts catch up, the settlers lose everything. Heller and his associates have done this in at least 7 cases that the marshal's office has identified. Inez said nothing. Her face had gone very still, the way a pond goes still before something surfaces. They believe Thomas was involved in identifying targets, Seth continued, keeping his voice level and his eyes on her face. Settlers who were vulnerable. Newcomers who did not know the land records well enough to verify title. He had access to that kind of information through his work at the mining company. And what, Inez said, does this have to do with me? It has to do with your land, Seth said. The marshal's office wanted to know if the claim on this property was acquired through Heller's network. If it was, you may not have legal title to what you have been living on and working for the past 18 months. There it was. The thing she had not seen coming. The hidden trap buried under the ordinary surface of her Tuesday morning, sprung open now in her own kitchen by a man with sun-weathered eyes and careful hands, and the expression of someone who genuinely hated what he had been sent to say. Inez Lawson was not a woman who fell apart. She had made an art form of not falling apart. But she felt in that moment the particular vertigo of someone who has been walking on ground they believed was solid and has discovered a hollow space beneath their feet. You have been standing at my fence every morning for 3 weeks, she said, and her voice was low and precise. While knowing this, yes, why did you not simply come to my door and tell me? Seth was quiet for a moment. Honest people, she would learn, went quiet before important truths. Because I needed to determine first whether you were in danger, he said. Cord Heller is not a man who leaves loose ends. If Thomas was involved with him and then died, Heller may have concerns about what Thomas told you or what Thomas left behind. I did not want to come to your door and announce that you might be a target before I knew whether you were being watched. And am I, she said, being watched? Not by anyone Heller has sent, Seth said. Not that I have been able to determine. But the investigation is active, and Heller himself was seen in Billings 3 weeks ago, which is close enough to make me careful. Inez reached up and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose. It was a gesture of contained emotion, of someone pressing the lid down on something that would otherwise overflow. My son, she said. Caleb. He is not in danger from what I currently know, Seth said. But I wanted you to have the truth. And I wanted you to have it from me rather than from a federal marshal arriving at your door with papers. Inez lowered her hand and looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read. There was anger in it, and there was something else, something that might have been the beginning of a very reluctant trust, the kind that forms not from warmth but from recognizing that someone has done you the rare courtesy of telling you a hard truth when a comfortable lie would have been easier. What do I need to do? She said. And that was the second beginning, the practical one, the one that would bring Seth Hayes in and out of her kitchen over the following weeks, the one that would transform 3 weeks of silent morning vigils into something far more complicated and far more dangerous than either of them had expected. Inez spent the first 3 days after that conversation in a state of contained fury, directed almost entirely at the memory of her dead husband. She went through every document she possessed with methodical intensity, spreading papers across the kitchen table after Caleb went to sleep, reading land records by lamplight, tracing the chain of title on the Harlan Creek property back through county records that Seth brought her from the courthouse. What she found was not entirely damning and not entirely clear. The original claim on the land had been filed by a man named Dewhurst in 1879. Thomas had purchased it from a third party named Alcott in early 1881. Whether Alcott had obtained it legitimately from Dewhurst or whether it had passed through Cord Heller's fraudulent machinery was a question buried in records that lived in Helena. Seth sent telegrams. He rode to the county seat and came back with copies of filings. He was thorough in the way that careful people are thorough, not flashy but systematic, working through the problem the way you work through a thicket, one branch at a time. And every morning still, she saw him from her kitchen window. But now he did not stand at the fence. Now he walked up the path, knocked twice on the door, and came in for coffee. They sat across the table from each other and talked through what had been found the day before and what still needed finding, and Caleb appeared from the back room rumpled with sleep and regarded Seth with the frank assessment of a 7-year-old who had been raised by a woman who encouraged frankness. "Are you the sheriff?" Caleb asked, the second morning Seth appeared at the door. "I am," Seth said. "My teacher says the sheriff here is reliable," Caleb said. "She says the last one was not." "Your teacher is correct on both counts," Seth said. Caleb seemed to find this satisfactory. He ate his breakfast and went to school, and Inez watched him go from the window and then turned back to the table and found Seth watching her with an expression she did not yet know how to categorize. "He looks like you," Seth said. "He does not," Inez said. "He looks like himself." Seth almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything resembling a smile from him, and it did something unexpected to the quality of the air in the room. Inez turned back to the papers on the table. The investigation took a complicated turn in the second week of December, when a man named Rudd appeared in Harlan Creek, asking questions at the saloon about 40-acre homesteads on the west side of town, and a widow woman who had come up from Butte the previous year. Rudd was not subtle, which was either a sign of confidence or stupidity, and the bartender at the Harlan Creek saloon, a garrulous man named Pettigrew who had strong opinions about strangers asking pointed questions, mentioned it to Seth the same afternoon. Seth told Inez that evening, standing in her kitchen while snow tapped against the window glass in small dry flakes that meant the real storm was still a day away. "Heller sent someone," she said. "It was not a question." "Almost certainly," Seth said. "Rudd is a known associate. He has done this kind of reconnaissance before ahead of Heller's operations." Inez was standing at the stove, and she turned around with the kettle still in her hand, and for the first time since Seth had known her, something that was not anger and was not calculation moved across her face, something that was simpler and more honest, something that was afraid. "What does he want to know?" She said. "Whether you have the documents," Seth said. "Thomas may have kept records of the transactions. If Heller believes those records still exist and that you have them, he needs to either retrieve them or ensure you cannot use them." "I do not have any records," Inez said. "Thomas told me nothing. He was very good at telling me nothing." There was a bitterness in that last sentence, old and familiar, the kind that had been worn smooth by long handling. "I know," Seth said. "But Heller does not know what you know, and that uncertainty makes you a problem for him." Inez set the kettle down. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked at Seth with that level, measuring gaze that he had come to recognize as her version of thinking out loud. "What would you do?" she said. "If it were your problem, I would let him think I have something worth protecting," Seth said. "I would make him come to me on terms I control rather than letting him operate in the dark." Inez was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That sounds like setting a trap." "It is," Seth said, "a careful one." "And what do I do while you are being careful?" "You are not a passive participant in this," Seth said. "I need your help. I need you to let Rudd see you. Normal activities. But I also need you to go through everything Thomas ever gave you. Every paper, every letter, even things that seem insignificant. If there are records, even partial ones, they could be valuable to the federal case." Inez uncrossed her arms. Some decision had been made behind her eyes. "All right," she said, "but I need something from you in return." "Name it," Seth said. "I need to know that when this is over, my title to this land is clear," she said. "I have built something here. My son has a school and a home here. I am not interested in doing your investigation's work for you if the result is that a federal marshal shows up in spring and tells me I have to leave." "I cannot guarantee outcomes I do not control," Seth said, "but I will do everything I can. I will advocate for you with the marshal's office. Your cooperation will carry weight." Inez looked at him for a long moment. In that kitchen, with the snow outside and the lamplight warm and gold between them, Seth Hayes felt something he had not felt in years, the particular pull of a person who has decided to trust you, and the weight of responsibility that comes with it. "That is the most honest answer you could have given me," she said. "I try," he said. "I have noticed," she said, and turned back to the stove. The trap was set over the following 10 days, and it required a delicacy that Seth found both professionally demanding and personally educational, because it required him to spend considerably more time in Inez Lawson's kitchen, at Inez Lawson's table, across from Inez Lawson's sharp attention, than he had spent in close proximity to any human being in the 4 years since Clara died. He found this unsettling in a way he did not immediately have language for. Seth Hayes was a man who had become accustomed to his own company, who had constructed a careful solitude out of the raw material of his grief and called it self-sufficiency. He ate alone. He slept alone. He did his work and did it well, and kept the distance between himself and everyone else in Harlan Creek at a polite and manageable width. He had not planned to change any of this. He had come to Inez Lawson's fence every morning because duty had brought him there, because he had a responsibility to a woman in his jurisdiction who might be in danger, and he had told himself this was the only reason, with the conviction of a man who is not yet ready to examine his own hidden motives. But Inez Lawson was not the kind of person you could be near without being known, because she paid attention the way other people breathed, automatically and continuously, and the things she noticed she filed with the precision of someone who understood that information was survival. She noticed, for example, that Seth never ate the biscuits she put on the table on the mornings Caleb was there, but always ate them when Caleb was gone to school. She asked him about it directly, the way she asked about everything directly. "You do not eat when the boy is here," she said. "Why?" Seth considered this. "I do not want him to get used to me being here," he said. Inez looked at him with an expression that was complicated and very steady. "That is either very thoughtful or very sad," she said. "Possibly both." "Possibly," Seth agreed. She noticed that he wore his badge only when he was officially on duty, that when he came to her house in the early morning he came without it, as if he were making a distinction between the visit as law enforcement and the visit as something else, something he perhaps had not named yet either. She noticed the way his hands rested on the table between them, large and still, and she noticed, in a way she found inconvenient, that she had started to find his stillness comforting rather than unreadable. She did not say any of this. She was a woman who had learned the hard way that saying things too soon was its own form of vulnerability. But she filed it, all of it, in the careful interior archive she kept of the things she understood. Caleb, who had been raised by a woman who thought clearly, also thought clearly, and he arrived home from school one afternoon in the second week of December to find Seth sitting at the kitchen table with a spread of documents between them, and he stood in the doorway for a moment studying this tableau with the gravity of a 7-year-old who is doing important work. "Are you trying to solve something?" Caleb asked. "We are," Seth said. "Like a puzzle." "Something like that," Inez said from the stove. "Come wash your hands." Caleb washed his hands but continued to study Seth with that frank judicial gaze. "My teacher says puzzles get easier if you know where to start," he said. "Your teacher is right again," Seth said. "Where do you start?" Caleb asked. Seth looked across the table at Inez and she looked back at him, and something passed between them in that glance that was quicker and quieter than a conversation but carried roughly the same content. "You start with what you know for certain," Seth said, "and you build from there." Caleb nodded as if this were entirely satisfactory and went to his room, and Inez turned back to the stove, and Seth looked at the documents in front of him, and the kitchen settled around them with a domesticity that neither of them was prepared for, and that both of them, in their separate silences, noted with something between alarm and wonder. The plan came together in the way good plans do, not all at once but in stages, each piece fitting against the next with the pragmatic elegance of necessity. Inez, under Seth's guidance, allowed herself to be seen at the general store asking questions about land records, making it known, in the way things are known in a town of 300 people, that she had discovered some documents among her late husband's belongings that seemed to be related to property transactions. She did this with the natural authority of a woman who believes she is doing something ordinary, which was the most convincing performance she could have given, because it was very close to true. The documents she had actually found, in a box at the bottom of Thomas's trunk that she had put in the back of her closet the day she arrived in Harlan Creek, and had not had the emotional wherewithal to open until now, were not what either of them had expected. There were 2 letters in Thomas's handwriting, addressed to someone identified only as CH, which were almost certainly Cord Heller, though there was nothing in the letters that named him directly. The letters discussed land values in the Harlan Creek area, mentioned several property owners by name, and referenced a set of transaction records that Thomas called the ledger. They were not, on their own, legally conclusive. But they were significant. There was also a third document, this one not in Thomas's handwriting, which appeared to be a partial ledger page with property description, purchase prices, and names that matched 3 of the 7 fraudulent transactions the marshal's office had already identified. Seth held this third document under the lamp for a long time. "This is evidence," he said. "Real evidence." "I know," Inez said. "It also means Thomas was more deeply involved than the marshal's office suspected." Inez was very quiet. "I need you to know," Seth said carefully, "that having this does not determine what kind of man Thomas was in total. People are more than the worst things they do. But it does mean that his involvement was real." "I know that too," Inez said. Her voice was level and she kept her eyes on the lamp, the steady flame of it. "I have been sitting with what Thomas was and was not for 2 years. I knew even then that there were things he was not telling me. I chose to believe it was ordinary reticence. It was not. The betrayal of that is real," Seth said. "The anger about it is fair." She looked at him then, and her eyes were bright with something that was not tears but was adjacent to them, the brightness of someone holding a very heavy thing with no intention of setting it down. "Yes," she said, "it is." He did not say anything else about it, because she did not need platitudes and he did not deal in them. But he stayed at the table another hour, and they did not talk about the documents for most of it, and somewhere in that hour, in the particular quiet of 2 people sitting together in the presence of hard truth, something shifted between them that could not be shifted back. Cord Heller arrived in Harlan Creek on the 18th of December. He was not what Inez had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. She saw him from her window the morning after his arrival, passing along the main street in a dark coat, a well-built man of perhaps 50, with the easy bearing of someone accustomed to being underestimated. He did not look like a criminal. He looked like a businessman, which Seth, when she described this to him, said was approximately the same thing in certain contexts. Seth had telegraphed the county marshal's office in Helena the moment the partial ledger page had been identified, and there was a deputy marshal named Foss traveling overland to Harlan Creek, expected within 3 or 4 days, weather permitting. The weather was not initially permitting, which meant Seth was managing a man who had come to retrieve or destroy evidence, in a town of 300 people, in the middle of a Montana December, with no official backup and a plan that depended on timing and nerve. He came to Inez's door the morning of the 19th and told her this directly, because she had earned direct information and he had stopped pretending otherwise. "Heller is here," he said, sitting across from her with both hands flat on the table in the way she now recognized as his signal for hard honesty. "He knows you have something. He will try to approach you today or tomorrow, I believe, through channels that seem innocent. An introduction at the store, a casual inquiry. He will not use force, not yet, not until he has assessed what you actually have." "And what do I do when he approaches?" she said. "You are cordial," Seth said. "You do not volunteer information. If he asks about your husband's papers, you say that you have found some things but have not had time to go through all of it, that it has been difficult, which is true enough. You give him nothing concrete, but you make him believe the ledger exists and that you are uncertain of its significance. To keep him in town, Inez said. Until your marshal arrives. Yes, and if he does not wait, Seth's jaw tightened slightly. I will be watching, he said. You will not be alone. Inez looked at him steadily. I know that, she said, and the simplicity of it, the plainness of it, the fact that she said it as though knowing it were the most natural thing in the world, stopped Seth somewhere behind his ribs in a way he was not equipped to articulate. Cord Heller made his approach on the afternoon of the 19th, in the general store, which was exactly as Seth had predicted. He introduced himself as a land agent from Billings, expressed condolences about Thomas with the practiced warmth of a man who has performed sympathy many times without feeling it, and asked, with perfect casualness, whether Inez had been considering her options regarding the property, whether she had thought about selling now that she was managing it alone. Inez was magnificent. She thanked him for his concern with a warmth that was precisely calibrated to seem genuine, mentioned that she was going through Thomas's papers still, and had found things she did not quite understand, and said that she would certainly keep his card if she decided she needed advice on property matters. She gave him nothing and made him believe she had everything, and she did it with such effortless ease that Seth, watching from the other side of a shelving unit in the back of the store, felt the particular kind of admiration that goes beyond respect into something closer to awe. Heller left the store with what he believed was a promising lead, and what was actually a carefully constructed dead end, and Inez walked home in the thin December sunlight with her hands loose at her sides, and a focused expression that did not crack until she was inside her own kitchen with the door shut. Then she sat down heavily in her chair and pressed both hands over her face and breathed through them for 30 seconds. Not from fear, from the sheer effort of sustained performance in the presence of a man she understood, on a very deep level, to be genuinely dangerous. Seth came through the door 10 minutes later, having taken the long way around to avoid being seen following her, and he stopped just inside the kitchen and looked at her, and she took her hands away from her face and looked back at him. That was excellently done, he said. I know, she said. I need coffee. He made it. He had learned where she kept everything in the past weeks, the coffee in the tin on the left of the stove, the cups on the second shelf, and he moved through her kitchen with the ease of familiarity without ever overstepping the invisible line of her self-sufficiency, never making himself more at home than she had implicitly permitted, always leaving the choosing to her. She had noticed this too. She was noticing everything about him with an involuntary thoroughness that she found both inconvenient and undeniable. He set the cup in front of her and sat down across the table. Heller will try to search the property, he said. He will not take my word that there is nothing here worth finding. He needs to see for himself. You want him to search the house, Inez said. I want him to try, Seth said, and I want to be here when he does. Inez wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. You are going to sleep here, she said. It was not quite a question. In the barn, Seth said, or on your porch if you would rather. I am not suggesting anything improper. Inez looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding something. Then she said, the barn, the porch is too visible. I do not want him to see that I am being guarded. Seth nodded. Inez said, and something in her voice changed slightly, became more careful. I want you to know that the improper concern is not my primary concern. Seth looked at her. My primary concern, she said, is Caleb. He will notice if you are here in the mornings. He will form expectations. I understand, Seth said. I will be gone before he wakes. Inez looked at the table, then back at him. You are a very careful man, she said. I have reasons to be, he said. So do I, she said. There was a pause, and in that pause the space between where they were and where they were heading toward felt very thin, like ice over a river in early spring, the kind you know will hold you today but that you are conscious of constantly with every step. I know about your wife, Inez said quietly. Clara, people in town have mentioned it. I am sorry. Seth was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said. How long ago? 4 years this winter. Inez looked at her coffee cup. Grief takes what it takes, she said. No one else gets to set the schedule. No, Seth said, they do not. They sat in the warm kitchen with that understanding between them. Two people who knew grief from the inside, who knew its particular weight and texture, who had survived it, not by recovering from it, but by continuing to move in its presence. And the recognition of this shared knowledge was its own quiet intimacy. Seth slept in the barn that night and the 2 nights following, wrapped in 2 blankets over clean straw, and Inez left the lamp in the kitchen window, which was not a signal they had agreed upon but which he understood as one, a small flag of light that meant everything was all right in the house. And he watched it from the barn door in the dark Montana cold, and felt something he would not have been able to name if asked, but that had warmth in it. Deputy Marshal Foss arrived on the morning of December 21st, having ridden through 2 days of intermittent snowfall with the methodical determination of a federal officer on a deadline. He was a compact man, efficient and not particularly warm, and he came directly to Seth's office and reviewed the documents and confirmed that the ledger page was exactly what the marshal's office had been looking for. "This gives us jurisdiction for an arrest," Foss said. "Where is Heller now?" "Staying at the boarding house on 2nd Street, Seth said. "He does not know the documents have been forwarded. He believes he is still in the intelligence-gathering phase." "Good," Foss said. "I want him taken quietly, no spectacle." "Agreed," Seth said, "but there is a condition." Foss looked at him. "Inez Lawson's cooperation produced that evidence," Seth said. "She is the one who found it and who held Heller in place long enough for you to get here. I need your assurance that the title to her property will be reviewed through legitimate channels, and that she will not face eviction as a result of her husband's activities, given her full cooperation with this office." Foss regarded him with the expression of a man who is being asked to make a promise he may or may not have authority to keep. "I cannot clear the title," he said. "That is a court matter." "I know," Seth said. "I am asking for your written recommendation to the court that her cooperation be considered, and for this office's assurance that we will not pursue any action against her in the period while the title is under review." Foss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is reasonable. I will put it in writing." The arrest of Cord Heller was made at 2 in the afternoon on December 21st, in the lobby of the boarding house, with a quietness that the town of Harlan Creek would talk about for years precisely because of how unspectacular it was. Seth walked in with Foss and one of his own deputies, a steady young man named Alcott, and Heller was informed of the charges and stood and came without resistance, with the composed bitterness of a man who has run the odds and understands when they have turned. As they let him out, Heller passed Seth in the doorway and stopped for one measured second and looked at him with cold clarity. "The widow gave you the ledger," he said. "The widow," Seth said, "gave you more time than you deserved and more dignity than you earned. Move along." Heller moved along. Foss took him on the first stage east to Helena the following morning, and Harlan Creek returned to the ordinary business of its December with the slightly dazed quality of a town that has been holding its breath and has been given permission to exhale. Inez heard about the arrest from Caleb, who had heard about it from his teacher, who had heard about it from the Deputy Alcott's wife, which was the precise chain of transmission by which news traveled in a town of 300 people. She was at the kitchen table when Caleb burst through the door with the news, and she listened to it with an expression Caleb could not quite read, and then she said, "Go wash your hands for supper." And when he was gone, she sat in the kitchen for a long time alone with the particular quiet of something ending. Seth came to her door that evening, not at his usual early morning time, but in the evening dark, with a lamp burning orange on the porch. And she opened the door before he knocked, because she had seen him coming up the path from the kitchen window. She stepped back to let him in, and he came inside, and they stood in the kitchen in the evening stillness. And for the first time since she had opened the gate on a Tuesday morning in November, there was no practical problem between them, no document to review, no plan to discuss, no threat to manage. There was just the kitchen and the lamplight and the two of them standing in it. "It is done," Seth said. "Yes," Inez said. Foss will file his recommendation with the territorial court, Seth said. It will take several months for the review, but I believe the outcome will be in your favor. The Dewhurst claim is old enough and obscure enough that the chain of title may hold regardless of what Heller was doing downstream. Inez nodded. She was looking at him with an expression he had learned to read over the past weeks, the one that meant she was deciding something. You slept in my barn for 3 nights, she said. I did, he said. You have been managing my safety for nearly 2 months, she said. I have, he said. And in the morning, she said, there will be no reason for you to come back. The word landed in the kitchen with a particular weight, and Seth Hayes, who chose his words carefully and was honest with them when he chose them, looked at Inez Lawson in the lamplight and said, There will be reason, if you want there to be. The silence that followed was the kind that is not empty but full, crowded with everything that has been building toward the moment of saying it. Inez looked at her hands, then back at him. I have been very careful, she said, about what I want. I know, Seth said. My husband taught me to be careful about it, she said. He also taught me, by way of example, what it looks like when the person you have chosen is not honest with you. What the consequences of that are. I have not been anything but honest with you since the first morning, Seth said. I know that too, she said. That is the part I keep coming back to. Seth took one step toward her, not closing the distance entirely but changing it, and she did not step back, which was its own kind of answer. I am not asking you for anything that frightens you, he said. I am only telling you that I have a reason to come back, every morning if you will have me, not at the fence. At the door. Inez Lawson, who had survived grief and betrayal and a land fraud investigation, and 3 weeks of watching a man stand at her fence in the cold Montana morning, looked at Seth Hayes for a long moment, and then she said, with the directness she applied to everything that mattered, Come for breakfast. 7 o'clock. We will see. He smiled. It was not the almost smile she had seen before, but a full one, and it changed his face in a way that she filed immediately in the interior archive she kept of important things. 7 o'clock, he said. He came at 7 o'clock. He came the next morning and the morning after that, and Caleb began to expect him at the table with the adaptability of a child who is fundamentally secure, and who has, moreover, his mother's gift for reading people accurately. Caleb decided Seth was acceptable within the first week, and expressed this assessment by beginning to ask Seth questions during breakfast with the relentless curiosity of a 7-year-old who has identified a new and interesting source of information. Did you ever shoot anybody? Caleb asked one morning in early January. Caleb, Inez said. That is a fair question, Seth said. Yes, I have in the line of duty been in situations where I had to fire my weapon. Caleb considered this with appropriate gravity. Did they shoot back? Sometimes, Seth said. Were you scared? Seth thought about this honestly, which was the only way he thought about things. Yes, he said. Being scared is not the absence of courage. It is the reason courage is necessary. Caleb turned this over in his mind for a moment, then went back to his biscuit. Inez, across the table, kept her eyes on her coffee, but the corner of her mouth moved in a way that Seth had learned to watch for. January settled over Harlan Creek with the heavy permanence of a real Montana winter, snow packing solid in the streets, the temperature dropping to ranges that discouraged everything but necessary movement. The mornings in Inez's kitchen became the anchor of Seth's day, the thing he oriented everything else around, and he was sufficiently honest with himself by mid-January to acknowledge this without dressing it in the language of duty or neighborly concern. He was falling in love with Inez Lawson. He had possibly been falling in love with her since the first morning she had stood at the fence with white knuckles and blazing eyes and asked him what he wanted. And he had not known how to say the true answer, which was that he had wanted, for the first time in 4 years, to be somewhere near another human being for reasons that had nothing to do with work. He was not certain for most of January that the feeling was returned, because Inez was careful and deliberate and did not give away what she felt until she had decided to give it. But there were signs, small and precise, that he collected the way he collected evidence methodically, building a case. The way she always had his coffee ready exactly as he took it, which meant she had been paying attention to how he took it. The way she laughed at things he said, not with the performed appreciation of someone being polite, but with the quick, genuine laughter of someone caught off guard, which meant he was managing to surprise her. The way she had started leaving the lamp in the kitchen window, even after there was no longer any danger that required it, which was, he thought, perhaps the most eloquent thing she had said to him that she had not said in words. He told her about Clara on a Wednesday evening in late January, sitting at the kitchen table after Caleb was in bed, the fire low and the snow steady outside, because he understood that she needed to know, and because not telling her felt like a secret between them, and he was done with secrets. He told her about meeting Clara in Ohio, about the early years of their marriage, about Clara's courage and her humor and her stubbornness, which had been considerable. He told her about the pregnancy and the fear that had preceded it and the grief that had followed it, and he told her about coming west not to heal exactly, but to be somewhere new enough that the grief did not have a shape attached to every familiar object and every familiar face. Inez listened to all of it without interrupting, which was her greatest gift, the quality of her attention. When he was finished, she said, "She sounds like someone worth grieving." She was, Seth said. "You do not need to stop grieving her to be here," Inez said. "I need you to know that. I am not asking you to put her away somewhere." Seth looked at her across the table, and the quality of his regard was the kind that changes things. "I know," he said. "You have never asked me for anything that cost me something I should keep." Inez's eyes were bright again, that brightness that was not tears but was adjacent to them. "Thomas never understood what it cost me," she said. "The hiding, the not being told, the not being included. I do not need you to be easy, Seth. I need you to be honest." It was the first time she had called him by his first name, and she heard it herself, heard the shift it made, and she looked at the table for a moment with the expression of someone who has said something true and is checking to see whether the world has changed. It had slightly in the good direction. "Inez," Seth said, and his voice had something new in it, a warmth that he had been keeping careful since the beginning. "I can be honest. It is the one thing I know how to do without effort." She looked at him and he looked at her, and then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, warm and sure, and then she took it back and stood up and said, "I will see you at 7 o'clock." He left in the cold January night with his breath making white clouds in the dark, and something warm and bright, an entirely new sitting in his chest like a coal that had been blown back to life from what he had believed was cold ash. And he walked back to his house on the north side of town under a sky crowded with stars, and understood, with the clarity that comes to people who have been honest with themselves long enough, that he was no longer falling toward anything. He had arrived. February brought 3 things to Harlan Creek: a Chinook that melted 2 weeks of snow in 2 days, a letter from the territorial court in Helena regarding Inez's land title, and the first moment in which Seth Hayes and Inez Lawson stood close enough together that not doing something would have been a more deliberate choice than doing something. The letter from Helena came first. Seth brought it to her at 7 in the morning without having opened it, because it was addressed to her, and the decision about what it meant was hers to make. She opened it at the kitchen table while he sat across from her, and she read it twice, very carefully, and then she set it down. "The title is clear," she said. "The Dewhurst claim is valid. The court has confirmed my right to the property." The relief that moved across her face was not dramatic. It was quiet, the relief of something that has been held braced against impact for a long time finally being allowed to be still. Seth let out a breath he had been holding since December. "Good," he said. Inez looked at the letter for another moment. Then she looked at him. "Thank you," she said, "for the beginning of this. For standing at the fence." "I would stand at a great many fences," Seth said, "for the outcome of being invited inside." She laughed, that quick, genuine laugh, and the kitchen filled with it, and Seth thought that there was not a better sound in the world than Inez Lawson laughing in her own kitchen on a February morning, with good news on the table between them. The second thing, the close enough moment, happened 2 days later, when they were both in the kitchen and Caleb was at school, and Inez was reaching for something on the high shelf above the stove, and her foot slipped on the wet floorboards near the water bucket, and Seth was across the kitchen in 2 steps and caught her before she could fall, his hands at her waist, her hands catching at his forearms. And they stood there for a stunned second in the kitchen, with the morning light coming through the window and the smell of coffee in the air, and the whole unmistakable fact of being close to each other in a way that was not accidental and was not professional, and was not anything except what it was. Inez looked at him, he looked at her. Neither of them stepped back. "I did not need rescuing," she said. "I know," he said. "I was closer." Her hands, which were still on his forearms, did not move. His hands at her waist did not move either. "Seth," she said quietly, with all the careful deliberateness of a woman who does not do things without deciding to do them. "Yes," he said. "I have decided," she said, "that I would like you to stay, not for breakfast. Not as a practical arrangement. I would like you to stay because I want you here, and because I trust you, and because the mornings are better with you in them." Seth Hayes, who had stood at a fence for 3 weeks in the cold Montana morning, because he had not known any other way to be present for a woman who needed presence, who had carried coffee cups and land records and hard truths across a kitchen table for 2 months, because that was the only currency he had that she had agreed to accept, looked at Inez Lawson in the February morning and said, very simply, "I am not going anywhere." And then, because she had decided and decisions in this kitchen were acted on, she stepped the remaining distance between them and he met her halfway. And the first time they kissed was in the warm kitchen with the coffee going cold on the stove and the morning light full and honest through the window. And it was not careful or tentative but steady and sure. The kiss of two people who have taken the long way to a thing and who know, arriving, that the long way was exactly right. March came in with wind and went out with mud and the particular chaos of a Montana spring thaw, and by the time April arrived and turned the hills east of Harlan Creek green, and the creek itself running high and loud with snowmelt, Seth Hayes and Inez Lawson had stopped pretending to the town that their morning visits were anything other than what they were, which the town, with the practiced intuition of a small community that watches everything, had already known for some time. Caleb had received the information in his own direct way. "Are you going to marry my mother?" he asked Seth one Saturday morning in March, over eggs, with the directness that was the most obvious of his inheritances from Inez. Inez, at the stove, went very still. Seth, across the table, considered the question with full seriousness, as he considered everything Caleb said, because he had understood early that the best way to earn a child's respect is to treat his questions as worthy of real answers. "I would like to," Seth said, "but that is a question your mother has to answer." Caleb turned to look at his mother. "Would you like to?" he asked. Inez turned around from the stove with an expression that was on the precipice of laughter and losing the fight with it. "That is a very private matter, Caleb," she said. "I live here," Caleb said reasonably. "It is not private from me." Inez set down the spatula. She looked at Seth and Seth looked back at her, and the air between them had that specific quality of something inevitable finally arriving. "Come outside with me for a moment," Inez said to Seth. They went out onto the back porch in the March morning with the wind coming down from the mountains still cold enough to sting, and Inez folded her arms against it and looked at the mountains for a moment and then turned to Seth. "He is not wrong," she said. "He does live here." "He does," Seth said. "And he is not wrong that it is relevant to him," she said. "He is not," Seth said. "I have been thinking," Inez said carefully in the way she said important things, "about what it would mean. For me, for him, for you. I have been thinking about what it requires of each of us and what it gives to each of us and whether those things are in balance." "And," Seth said. Inez looked at him with those steady, measuring eyes. "And I think," she said, That it requires honesty from both of us on a permanent basis. It requires patience because I do not change easily and I know that. It requires you to understand that I have already been a wife to a man who decided what I needed to know and what I did not, and that I will not do that again. I have never wanted to be that man, Seth said. I know, she said. That is why we are having this conversation. She paused. It also requires me to admit that I am afraid still, that the fear is not a reason not to do it, but that it is real, and I need you to know it is real. Fear and love are not opposites, Seth said. They occupy the same territory. You just have to know which one is driving. Inez looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the pines on the ridge above the property, a sound like breathing. Yes, she said. I will marry you. Seth reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood on the back porch in the March morning with the mountains above them and the sound of Caleb inside the house. And the simplicity of that moment was the most beautiful thing either of them had been inside for a very long time. They were married in June of 1883, in the small Methodist church on Main Street in Harlan Creek, on a clear day with the mountains blue and distant, and the wildflowers in the meadows east of town rioting in the early summer warmth. Inez wore a dress of pale gray silk, which was the most practical, beautiful thing she could find, and Seth wore his good suit with his badge pinned to the lapel, not because duty required it, but because Inez had said she liked the look of it, and he had discovered in the months of knowing her that he was very interested in giving her the things she liked. Caleb stood beside Seth during the ceremony, because both of them had agreed this was appropriate, and because Caleb had expressed a strong personal preference for participation over observation, and it was genuinely difficult to argue with him. The Reverend was a gentle man named Hobart who had known both of them separately and was visibly pleased to be officiating the occasion. The town of Harlan Creek turned out with the enthusiasm of a community that had been watching this particular story develop for 7 months and felt a strong proprietary interest in its conclusion. Pettigrew, the bartender, had cried, which he denied. The schoolteacher had given Caleb a day off in honor of the occasion. Even Deputy Alcott, who was not naturally demonstrative, had shaken Seth's hand with unusual vigor and said, "Well done," which for Alcott constituted an extended speech. They did not go anywhere for a honeymoon, because there was the property to manage and Seth's duties did not pause for sentiment. But on the evening of the wedding, after Caleb was in bed and the kitchen was quiet, they sat together at the table that had been the site of so many of their most important conversations, and Inez put her head on Seth's shoulder, and Seth put his arm around her, and they sat in the lamplight in the kind of silence that is not absence but presence. That is not empty but full of everything that does not need saying because it is already known. "Do you remember," Inez said, after a long while, "the first morning you came inside, when you told me about Thomas?" "I remember," Seth said. "I was so angry," she said, "at Thomas and at you for being the one to tell me and at myself for not having known." "You had every right to be," Seth said. "I know," she said, "but I was also, underneath the anger, something I did not recognize at first. I was relieved that someone was telling me the truth, that there was someone there who thought I deserved to know it." Seth pressed his lips to the top of her hair. "You deserve to know," he said. "You deserve to know everything." Inez was quiet for a moment. "I am glad you stood at the fence," she said. "I am glad you asked me what I wanted," he said. "What would you have done if I had not?" she said. Seth thought about this honestly, which was the only way he thought about things. "I would have kept standing there," he said, "until you did." She laughed, that quick, bright laugh, and he laughed too, and the kitchen held them both in the warm summer dark. The autumn of 1883 brought changes to Harlan Creek that nobody had expected, and most people welcomed, including the completion of a spur line from the main Northern Pacific route that put the town within a half-day's journey of Billings by rail, which transformed its commercial prospects overnight. New businesses opened. New families arrived. Seth's work increased proportionally, and Inez, who had a gift for practical management that had been underutilized, began helping him with the administrative aspects of the sheriff's office, the paperwork and correspondence, and the careful record-keeping that Seth was honest enough to admit he found tedious. "You are essentially running half this office," Seth told her one evening, reviewing the neat order she had brought to the filing system. "I am running the half you were not running," she said, with perfect accuracy. Caleb, now 8, had settled into the rhythms of a family with the ease of a child who had been steady to begin with and who was now simply more steady. He called Seth by his name, not father, which was his own choice and which both Seth and Inez respected, though Seth had quietly made it clear, through action rather than words, that the word was available whenever Caleb wanted it. The moment Caleb chose, it came on an evening in October, entirely without ceremony, when he was telling a boy at school about his family and the boy asked if Seth was his real father, and Caleb had said, with the cool certainty of someone who has thought this through, "He is my father. He is about as real as they get." He had come home and told Inez this, and Inez had told Seth, and Seth had been very quiet and looked at the window for a while and then said, "That boy," in a voice that held things that did not fit into other words. In the spring of 1884, Inez told Seth she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, at 7 in the morning, which was where they told each other important things, and she did it simply and directly because she did not know another way, and she watched his face while she said it with the careful attention of someone who needs the truth of what they see. What she saw was Seth Hayes, 36 years old, former widower, man who had once stood at a fence in the cold morning, not knowing how to say what he wanted, go very still for 3 full seconds, and then reach across the table and take both her hands in his with a gentleness that was everything he had never been able to say out loud. "Are you frightened?" She said because she knew about Clara, because that knowledge lived between them as a real thing, not a dividing thing but a thing that had to be held carefully. "Yes," he said, "and I am glad, both at the same time." "Good," she said. "That is the correct amount of honesty." He brought her hands to his mouth and kissed them, and there were no words for a while, because words were not what the moment needed. The pregnancy was careful, and the months were long, and the summer of 1884 in Harlan Creek was hot and brilliant, and Inez was magnificently, uncompromisingly present throughout all of it, managing the household and the office correspondence and Caleb's increasingly complex questions about the world with the same focused competence she brought to everything. And Seth spent considerable energy in the last months ensuring she did not do more than was good for her, which she found alternately touching and extremely irritating. "I am not fragile," she said on a Saturday in August, when he had moved a heavy box from her hands for the 3rd time that week. "I know that," Seth said. "Then stop acting as though I am." "I am not acting as though you are fragile," Seth said patiently. "I am acting as though you are my wife who is 8 months along and has more good sense than to admit when something is too heavy." Inez looked at him with the expression that meant she had found this argument more fair than she had expected, and then she said, "Fine," which was her version of concession. Their son was born on the 5th of September, 1884, on a cool early morning that smelled of the first hint of coming autumn, and he arrived with the emphatic opinions of someone who has been waiting some time to make his presence known. They named him James, after Seth's father, with Thomas as a middle name, which was Inez's decision, and which Seth understood without having to ask, was not sentiment for Thomas Lawson so much as the particular kind of complexity that Inez brought to everything, the understanding that people are layered, that history is real, and that a child is entitled to know where he came from in all its complicated fullness. Caleb received his brother with the considered enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who has been consulted throughout the process and has consequently developed considerable investment in the outcome. He held James on the 2nd day with tremendous care and looked at him for a long time with an expression of solemn appraisal. "He is small," Caleb said. "They start that way," Seth said. "He has your eyes," Caleb said, looking up at Seth. "Does he?" Seth said, looking at the small face of his son. "The same color," Caleb said, "like winter pine." Seth looked at Caleb for a moment. "That is a fine thing to notice," he said. Caleb handed the baby carefully back to Inez and went outside, and Seth stood in the doorway watching him go. This boy who had come to him through grief and fraud and a cold Montana fence, and who had, in the course of a year and a half, quietly and without announcement, become as much his son as James, and the particular fullness of that moment was something he held in him like the lamp in the kitchen window, small and steady and not going anywhere. The winter of 1884 was the gentlest in Harlan Creek's memory, which most people took as a gift, and which allowed James Hayes to spend his first months in a house that was warm enough, and a family that was settled enough for the ordinary magic of a baby's early existence to play itself out without disruption. Inez nursed and slept and nursed again with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had done this before and who understood that it required, more than anything else, consistent presence, and Seth took the night walks with James when the baby was restless, pacing the kitchen in the dark with a child on his shoulder, and found in those night hours a particular peace he had not expected, a quietness that was different from solitude, that was company of the most fundamental kind. By the time James was 4 months old and beginning to show the alert, opinionated personality that would become his most recognizable characteristic, Seth and Inez had settled into a life together that had the texture of something genuinely built, not perfect but real, something that had been tested from the beginning by hard circumstances, and that had proven, through those tests, to be made of material that did not break easily. They argued because they were both people with strong minds and the habit of honesty, and their arguments were direct and complete and resolved, because neither of them was interested in letting things fester underground in the way that Thomas had let things fester. Seth was occasionally too contained, retreating into his own quiet when Inez wanted words, and she told him so plainly. Inez was occasionally too certain, assuming she knew the answer before Seth had finished the question, and he told her so with the patience of a man who found even her certainty fundamentally interesting. These were the ordinary difficulties of two strong people making a shared life, and they were navigated with the same resource that had built the life in the first place, honesty and patience, and the willingness to keep showing up at the other person's door. The spring of 1885 brought news from Helena that Cord Heller had been convicted on 7 counts of land fraud and sentenced to 12 years in the territorial prison, which Inez received with the particular quiet satisfaction of a thing being properly finished. She did not celebrate exactly, but that evening she took the 3 documents she had found in Thomas's trunk, the 2 letters and the partial ledger page, and burned them in the kitchen stove, not from any wish to destroy evidence. The court had its copies, but from the felt necessity of clearing the air of something that had lived in her house long enough. Seth watched her do it without comment, which was his recognition that this was hers to do. When the last paper had burned down to ash, Inez turned from the stove and looked at him, and she said, "That is the end of that." And the completeness of it was in her voice, the last door closing on a room she was done being in. "Yes," Seth said, "that is the end of that." Caleb, now 10, had grown into a boy who was recognizably his mother's child in his directness and his intellectual rigor, and who was also, in the subtler ways that have more to do with the quality of attention and the patience of manner, recognizably Seth's son in the ways that matter most. He had started to call Seth Pa, in the casual way of someone for whom the word has become so natural that it no longer requires a decision. It is simply what you call the person. And this happened so gradually and so entirely without ceremony that neither Seth nor Inez could have said exactly when it started, only that it was entirely correct when it did. In the summer of 1886, Inez found herself expecting again, which she told Seth in the kitchen at 7 in the morning with a directness that had not changed, and Seth received it with the same combination of real fear and larger gladness that he had received the first time, because he was consistent in this as in everything. "You are doing it again," Inez observed, watching his face. Going still for 3 seconds, he said. "Yes," she said. "I expect I will always do that," he said. "It is a lot of news." "It is," she said, and smiled at him, and the smile was the kind that carries history in it, that has been through something and come out the other side and knows exactly what it has. Their daughter arrived in February of 1887, in the deep cold of a Montana winter, and she was fierce and loud and entirely certain of her opinions from the first hour of her existence, which Inez said was proof of something and Seth did not argue with, because he had learned that Inez's proofs were generally sound. They named her Ruth, and she grew up in a house where honesty was the primary currency and love was demonstrated through attention, and both of these things shaped her in ways she would carry all her life. Caleb, 12 by the time Ruth arrived, took his role as eldest with grave seriousness and considerable competence, and James, now 2 and in possession of the active, investigating personality that had been apparent since his 4th month, regarded his sister with the territorial suspicion of a child who has not previously had to share the role of youngest, and then, within a week, with the proprietary affection of someone who has decided that this small person is his particular responsibility. The family in the house on the edge of Harlan Creek, the house with the garden that produced and the fence that stood straight, was not a simple family. It had history behind it that was complicated and sometimes painful, a dead man whose choices had shaped all their lives, a grief that had remade Seth Hayes before he arrived on this particular ground, a woman's careful and deliberate rebuilding of herself after the discovery that the person she had trusted most had not earned it. But these things, the complications and the history, were not buried. They were known by both of the people who had built this life together, and being known, they were not weights on the foundation but part of it, the material that gives a thing its particular character and its particular strength. On the morning of the 5th anniversary of the day Inez had finally opened the gate and asked Seth Hayes what he wanted, which fell on a Tuesday in November of 1887, Seth woke before dawn and lay in the warmth of their bed, listening to the particular quiet of a house with children sleeping in it. That full, breathing silence. And he thought about a man standing at a fence in the October cold, turning his hat in his hands, knowing there was something he needed to say, and not knowing how to begin. He had found the beginning and the end. He had found it the morning she asked him, with white knuckles and blazing eyes and a fury that was only barely covering the rower thing underneath, what it was he wanted. And he had told her the truth, the true truth, not the official one, and she had opened the gate, and everything that mattered had walked through it. When Inez woke, she found Seth sitting in the kitchen with the lamp lit and the coffee made, which was a reversal of their usual morning, and she stood in the kitchen doorway in her robe looking at him with the full attention she brought to him always, every day still. "You are up early," she said. "I was thinking," he said. "About what?" "About a man standing at a fence," he said, and how completely he did not know what was on the other side of it. Inez came to the table and poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him in the chair she had sat in on that first morning on that Tuesday 5 years ago, and she looked at him across the table with the measuring gaze she had brought to him since the beginning, only now it was not a gaze that was deciding anything. It was a gaze that already knew. "Do you know now?" she said. Seth looked at her, this woman who had asked him a question in the cold morning and changed the direction of everything by doing it, who had kept a lamp in the window and coffee ready at 7, and a directness that was the finest thing he had ever been on the receiving end of. "Yes," he said. "I know exactly." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, warm and sure, the same gesture she had made years ago in this same kitchen, and it meant the same thing it had always meant. Everything. And enough. Outside, the November morning was brightening over the Montana mountains, slow and clear, the way the best things arrive, without hurry, without spectacle, simply there, light where there had been dark, warmth where there had been cold. A whole ordinary, extraordinary day beginning in the valley of Harlan Creek, with the smoke rising from the chimneys and the sound of children waking in the rooms above, and the coffee going warm between two people who had found each other by the particular grace of honesty and patience and the stubborn willingness to stand at the fence until someone asked the question. And that was enough. That was everything. That was the whole story.